Hi everyone, my name is Kayla. Welcome back to Kay's Hidden Shelf, where we talk about books. Today I'm going to share with you the books that I read in April, and overall it was an okay reading month. For the books that I did read, I managed to finish 4 books, and from those, I did give them 4 to 4.5 out of 5-star ratings, which was great, but I did have a couple of DNFs. So let's talk about them. Let's start with the books that I DNF'd. And I will preface this by saying that I don't rate books that I DNF. I'll talk about it briefly as to the reasons why they didn't work for me, but I don't review or give ratings for books that I don't finish. The first book that I did not finish was Illborn by Daniel T. Jackson. Unfortunately, this just was not for me. I was reading this as a part of a buddy read that happened over at the Wizardly Duo Discord. Now, I will say that the reviews and feedback from there were a bit mixed. So some people really enjoyed it, some people did not, or they were in between. So there is definitely a varied group of readers on this one and views of it. For me, unfortunately, I DNF'd it at 50%. I really wanted to give this a good try, and I just got to the point where I was not excited to read it. For me, the story felt forced, it felt repetitive in areas, and I just did not care for the characters, which unfortunately added to DNFing it. I do see where people would love this, why it would work for them. Unfortunately, I just didn't share that love for it. So I'm hoping maybe to give it another try, maybe do a DNF redemption for this. Could have very well been the timing that I was reading it. But yeah, I'm gonna hang on to the copy for now and see if trying it again later might work better. Overall, right now, it just did not work for me. The next book that I DNF'd was The Hag of the Hills by J.T.T. Ryder. This is another epic fantasy by a self-published author. It's the story of a farm boy who's always wanted to be a warrior, but is stuck being at home taking care of the farm and is expected to by his family. That all changes when his village is wiped out and he gets his wish of being a warrior. Now, this sounded appealing, the story sounded interesting, and it just sounded like there was going to be a lot of action and adventure and maybe some heartbreak in this. Unfortunately, there was just a lot of info dumping, and the legends and lore and the world building felt more like a lecture as opposed to a story woven in with the world building. Now, the characters I also didn't really feel for. It just seemed like there were meant to be cares and heartbreaks that weren't built up in a way that made me care. I did end up DNFing it around 25%, though I did skim forward in areas further ahead to see if that writing style did change. Unfortunately, I did not see that, so I decided to put it down for the time being. I do see where people might enjoy this, but for me, I am always looking for a good story, and it just didn't feel that way. Let's jump into the books I did manage to read, starting with a short story from Flannery O'Connor, The Complete Short Stories. The one I did manage to read was Good Country People, I believe, and initially when I read this, I will say I was mad for the main character. She's just a country girl living with her mother, and she has very scientific beliefs, whereas the people around her are quite Catholic. And one day they have a visitor, a priest selling Bibles at their door. They end up hitting it off. Now, I will say while reading this, I was just mad for the main character that we see. But after talking to Leslie at the Nerdy Narrative, I just had to laugh at some of the references she made, as it just flipped the experience of the story for me from mad to just laughing and finding it hilarious. So it's definitely an interesting read, and there is a reoccurring theme of strangers coming into a story that might not bode well for the main characters. It's something I've come to expect from reading Flannery O'Connor so far, at least from how far I've gotten in this, and it just puts me on the edge of my seat every time I pick up a short story. So I'm really enjoying these, and thank you, Leslie, for putting a different spin on that story. The next one I managed to finish was not one I originally had on my MBR for April, but it was on the greater TBR list, and it got bumped up after watching Anitha's video of why you should read it. I'll leave a link where you can find her video. It was so well done, and that is Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. Now, this is my first book from Octavia E. Butler, and I have to say it was impactful. I ended up listening to this on audiobook, and it was so well done. The voices, the feeling that it brought to the characters and the story was fantastic. So this is a mix of sci-fi and historical fiction. It follows Dana, an African-American woman in 1967, I believe, in California. One day she gets pulled back into Maryland around the early 1800s, finds a boy drowning and tries to save him, only to find a shotgun pointed down at her, at which point she blips back to 1976. She continues to experience these insane moments of time jumping with this same boy. It just does the contrast of the time periods for Black people in particular between 1976 and early 1800s in Southern America really well. I will say the time jumping for me didn't really matter. I know people who love time aspects in books and who can't stand them altogether. For me, I was indifferent. I viewed this book as a means of making a point or telling a story and making a comparison between two time frames. Now, this is a short read at 287 pages, but that did not lessen the impact of this book, the story it told, the characters' situations, and the desperation that they feel because they are jumping back and forth between a time period that slavery was completely acceptable and the things that they did to Black people back then were considered okay. And of course, nowadays that is not the case. Seeing the contrast between it, the situations the character has to go through was definitely eye-opening for myself, at least. I'm used to seeing stuff like that in movies, but where I grew up, it's not necessarily something we learn about in history class. So it was interesting to see the dynamics, the situation, and I just felt very much for the characters in this. I'd highly recommend it if you're looking for some historical fiction. It was a fantastic read, and like I said, the time jumping aspect didn't really matter to me. If you're looking for something that is more story driven, this is definitely one you want to read. I ended up giving it 4.5 out of 5 stars. It's a beautifully told story that hits hard. The next book I managed to read was Nomads of the Sea by Coby Zucker. This is a self-published debut novel, and it is a copy I received in exchange for an honest review. I'll leave a link where you can find my full spoiler-free review for that up in the cards somewhere. Essentially, this is much more than I thought it was going to be. It's around 700 pages, so it is chunky, but it's a comfortable read with the text being larger. I know for some people that might be silly, but for me it matters in sense of comfort while reading. It has some dark, creepy moments. There's action in this, and throughout the story we follow 3 points of views from Sig, a warrior, Idalia, a scholar and healer, and Bryn, a mage. So there is a magic system in this. The world was really interesting, and the whole thing takes place in the Nisi archipelago. There's a dynamic of different cultures in this, a language barrier even, which adds tension to the story. There's political intrigue in this, and it all centers around a civil war. The world building and characters were done exceptionally well. It's one that I still think about after finishing this even a few weeks ago. I am so excited for book 2 because I want to see what happens with the characters, and I love the world so much in this. This is one I would highly recommend for readers who enjoy fantasy in general, but I will say there was a tone or a storytelling method that reminded me of both Joe Abercrombie and John Gwynne, so definitely recommend this as a read, and I believe it's available on Kindle Unlimited too. I ended up giving this 4.5 out of 5 stars. This is a fantastic debut. There's so much that I loved in this, and I just can't talk about because of spoilers. So I would highly recommend that others read this because I think there are many people who will enjoy this. The next two books were Unplanned, but that's what makes an MVR so interesting, I suppose. And the first one is Never Die by Rob J. Hayes. This is book one in the Mortal Techniques universe, and I will say that even though it's a part of a series, it is a standalone, so you can read just this without having to read the full trilogy. But I will say that the rest of the trilogy so far anyway seems well worth reading. I ended up reading this initially as an audiobook via Audible, and I will say that the first three books in the Mortal Techniques universe are all available for 1 credit. I could not pass that up. It is a self-published author and one I'd been meaning to try for quite some time. This was an adventurous read. It follows a young boy named Ian who has been tasked by a god to collect heroes of legend in order to kill the Emperor of 10 Kings. For the heroes to aid in his quest, they must first die. This was just full of action, witty banter, some memorable characters. We had great story progression, and there were some really creepy moments in this. All throughout this book, I was asking so many questions. The world building was fantastic. It is a short book at around 270 pages, so it is a quick read, I will say, and it was one I just did not want to put down. I am amazed at how much the author was able to pack in here. The characters' interactions with each other just felt natural, and the story progression was done in a way that really kept me on my toes. This is an Asian-inspired epic fantasy that would probably make for a great anime. I will say for the audiobook, it is narrated by Kim Breton, and I wasn't sure at first whether or not it was something I was going to enjoy, but as soon as she started narrating Ian's voice, I was hooked. She did so good with the different characters and getting that level of creepy across. I'd highly recommend this for anyone looking for a short, Asian-inspired, adventurous read. Overall, I gave this 4 out of 5 stars, and it's certainly one for the reread list. And because I enjoyed Never Die so much, and book 2 started right away after the audiobook, I continued right along with Pawn's Gambit by Rob J. Hayes. I loved this universe so much, and it continues on in this next standalone book within the series. In this, the world is the same, however, the characters we follow and the story we get is different. In this, once every 100 years, the gods hold a competition to see who will rule heaven and earth on the Jade Throne. The gods who are participating must each choose a mortal champion to take part in this competition. In addition, 5 years ago, you made a choice that cost her everything. As a renowned strategist for war and battle, she finds herself on the run with bounties on her head, and just seeing the story from the perspective of a strategist who uses intellect, puzzles, and logic to determine their next moves rather than a warrior who uses brute force to push through obstacles was really interesting and added so much to this story. This story is a mix of loss, discovery, adventure, and a bit of philosophy. Now, I will say that Pawn's Gambit I didn't find as gripping in the same way as Never Die. However, the tones of the two books are a bit different. The pacing in this did feel a bit slower at the beginning, with the last 10 to 20% just taking off in pace. However, I did find you and the side characters to be endearing, with some memorable moments in this. This is a great mix of character development and a high-stakes story. And while this is a standalone, I would recommend reading Never Die first. I found the world building much better in Never Die. It's just a better place to start for that introduction. And there are some references made in this to Never Die. So if you're looking for a fuller experience, I definitely recommend starting with Never Die first, but you absolutely don't have to. You can jump right into Pawn's Gambit and not worry about it because the experience is still fantastic. Overall, I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. The author's writing style, the method of storytelling that they use really has captured my interest. I'm looking forward to continuing in the Mortal Techniques universe and seeing what else the author's written. And I will just include quickly that I ended up getting physical copies of Never Die and Pawn's Gambit as early Mother's Day gifts from my fiance. He saw how much I was enjoying Never Die and wanted to get me physical copies of the books, but he saw I was reading Pawn's Gambit and he didn't want me to miss out on the reading experience along with the physical copies, so he ended up giving them to me early, which was absolutely sweet and thoughtful. So, huge shout out to my other half. So that's everything I read in April. Overall, it was a pretty good reading month, even though some books didn't work out as I hoped they would. What did you guys read in the month of April? Did you have a favorite from that month? Leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you all. Thank you so much for supporting the channel by watching, subscribing, interacting with me in the comments. I always appreciate hearing from you. And as always, take care of yourselves.